The HOA blocked my ranch plans. So I bought the only road to their homes and closed it off. They thought they could stop me. With letters. With fines. With threats. They thought they had all the power. But I found something they never saw coming. The only road in and out of the neighborhood. And when I bought it, I bought their freedom too. That was the moment everything changed. And what I did next would leave the whole suburb trapped in silence. Welcome to HOA Unit, where we bring you the wildest stories of suburban wars and petty revenge. My name is Daniel. I live in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Texas. By day, I work as a simple contractor, building fences, barns, and ranch homes. But by night, I tell you the stories the HOA never wants you to hear, and this one is about how a simple fence fight turned into the ultimate roadblock revenge. The day the HOA blocked my ranch plans was the day I learned how petty they could be. It started small. A letter in the mailbox, a simple envelope, no stamp, no kindness, just bold letters across the top. Notice of violation. I laughed when I saw it. I thought it was a mistake, maybe even a prank. But as I read the words, my smile disappeared. Your proposed fence is not in compliance with community standards. Your ranch plans are hereby rejected. And at the bottom, the signature of the HOA president, written in neat little loops, like she was proud of ruining dreams. I stood there in my driveway, holding the letter, while the sun burned down on the asphalt and across the street. I saw her, the HOA president, sitting in her car, sunglasses on, pretending to check her phone. But I knew she was watching me. She always watched. Every lawn, every mailbox, every tiny thing. She called it order. I called it control. My dream was simple. A small ranch behind my house, a place for my horses, a place where my kids could run free. I bought the land fair and square. I had the money, the permits, the right to build. But the HOA didn't care. They wanted everything to look the same. Cookie-cutter houses, cookie-cutter lawns, cookie-cutter lives. I remember walking inside, showing the letter to my wife. She sighed. She'd seen this coming. She told me they didn't like us from the start. Too different, too stubborn, too loud for their perfect little world. But I didn't believe it until that moment. The next morning, I drove past the HOA office. It wasn't really an office, just a small clubhouse near the pool. But to them, it was a throne room, their kingdom of rules and fines. And as I passed by, I saw the president standing with 2 board members. They were smiling, they were laughing, and when they looked at me, their smiles didn't fade. They grew sharper, colder, like wolves who had just smelled blood. Something inside me shifted that day. At first, I wanted to fight fair. I wrote letters. I appealed their decision. I called meetings. I asked for votes. But every time, they shut me down. Every time, they laughed behind closed doors. Every time, they reminded me that I was just one homeowner, and they were the board. Weeks passed. The letters kept coming. First it was about the fence, then it was about my grass, then it was about the color of my shed. Each letter came with a fine, $50, $100, $200. It was never ending, and it was never about rules. It was about breaking me. One evening, I stood in my yard staring at the unfinished fence, wood stacked neatly, nails shining in the fading light. I could almost hear my horses running, hooves on the dirt, laughter of my kids. But instead, all I heard was the voice of the HOA president echoing in my head. Not in compliance, not approved, not allowed. I clenched my fists. I knew I had 2 choices: give up my dream, or give them a fight they would never forget. And that night, sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through property listings, I saw it. A small strip of land for sale. It wasn't much. Just a road. One road. But not just any road. It was the only road that led into our neighborhood. My heart raced as I read the listing. The HOA hadn't bought it. The county had sold it off years ago, and now it was in private hands, for sale, to anyone willing to pay. I leaned back in my chair, smiling for the first time in weeks, because suddenly, everything changed. The HOA thought they had all the power, but they forgot one thing: without that road, they were nothing. I didn't tell anyone, not my wife, not my neighbors, not my friends. I just made the call. I signed the papers. I wired the money. And in one quiet transaction, the entire balance of power shifted. The road was mine. The next morning, I drove down that road with a new feeling in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't frustration. It was control. For the first time, I was the one holding the pen, and I was ready to write my own rules. But here's the question. What would you have done in my place? Would you have closed the road on them, or let them suffer slowly, knowing you owned their only way out? The road was mine, but the neighborhood was still theirs. When I drove through the gates that morning, I looked around at the rows of perfect houses, each one painted in the same dull shades of beige, each lawn clipped to the exact same height, each mailbox standing tall like soldiers in a line. It felt less like a neighborhood, and more like a prison dressed up as paradise. The HOA wanted control of everything, and they had it. People were scared of them, scared of fines, scared of letters, scared of losing the one thing they worked so hard to buy, their home. I watched the neighbors as they trimmed their bushes with rulers, as they measured their grass with tape, as they painted their shutters the exact shade written in the handbook. It wasn't living, it was surviving, and the HOA made sure everyone stayed in line. The clubhouse stood in the center of it all, a small brick building with white pillars, trying to look important every week. The board gathered inside like judges in a courtroom, the president at the head of the table, her two loyal board members at her side, and on the walls, framed pictures of past presidents, like a gallery of suburban dictators. I remember my first meeting with them. I had walked in with hope, thinking maybe we could reason, maybe we could compromise. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew there was no fairness here. The air was thick with perfume and power. The president smiled at me with those same empty eyes. She tapped her nails on the table and said, "You people think you can change things, but this neighborhood has rules." She slid the handbook across the table, a thick binder full of pages, full of laws about grass length, fence height, even mailbox paint. She wanted me to bow to it. She wanted me to surrender. But as I looked at that binder, I didn't see order. I saw chains, chains they used to keep everyone small, quiet, afraid. I walked out of that meeting with more anger than answers. And as I stepped into the parking lot, I saw the other homeowners waiting outside. Some of them whispered to me, told me to give up, told me it wasn't worth it. Others just kept their heads down, afraid even to look at me. It hit me then. They weren't neighbors anymore. They were prisoners. That night, I sat on my porch and watched the streetlights flicker across the road I now owned. I thought about the power of it. That road was their lifeline. Every car, every delivery truck, every visitor had to pass through it. Without it, they were stuck, trapped inside their perfect little box. The next morning, the HOA president drove by my house again. She slowed down, rolled her window down, gave me a long stare. She thought she was in control, but deep down, I knew something she didn't. The leash she used to choke me with was now wrapped around her own neck. I didn't act right away. I waited. I wanted them to feel safe, to think they had won. The letters kept coming. Fines stacked up. Threats grew sharper. But I didn't fight back this time. I just smiled and watched. Because every letter they sent me, every insult they whispered behind closed doors, made what I was about to do even sweeter. Then came the day of the annual HOA barbecue, the one day of the year when they invited everyone to the clubhouse. They called it a celebration of community. But it was really a parade of their own power, tables lined with perfect food, signs reminding people of their dues, speeches about rules and order. I went, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see them all together, in one place, eating and smiling like nothing was wrong. The president stood on the little stage, microphone in her hand. She talked about beauty standards. She talked about discipline. She talked about how rules protected property values. And as she spoke, I looked around at the crowd. Some clapped politely. Some cheered like trained dogs, but most just stared at their plates, eyes empty, hearts heavy. It wasn't a community. It was a kingdom. And the Queen was laughing at all of us that night when the barbecue ended. I drove down the road slowly. I rolled down my window, listened to the sound of tires on the pavement I now owned, and I realized something. They thought they had me cornered, but in truth, they were the ones living in my cage now. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how far I was willing to go. Would I lock the gates? Would I cut them off completely? Would I make them beg for every inch of freedom? The thought made me smile, but also made me wonder, because power is dangerous. It can turn anyone into the very thing they hate, and I had to ask myself, would I become like them? Or would I give them a taste of their own medicine in a way they'd never forget? Tell me, if you were in my shoes, what would you do with that kind of power? The first fine was $50. Small enough to laugh at, small enough to ignore. But then came the next, 100, then 200, then 500. Every week, another letter, another demand, another nail they tried to hammer into me. I kept the envelopes in a box under my bed. At first I thought I would use them in court, proof of harassment. But soon, they became trophies. Every letter was proof that I had gotten under their skin. Every fine was proof that the president couldn't control me the way she controlled everyone else. Neighbors started whispering when they saw me in the street. Some shook their heads, told me to just pay up and fall in line. Others smiled quietly, like they were living through me. Like my rebellion was the fight they were too afraid to start themselves. And through it all, the president kept driving by my house, slow, steady. Her cold smile never fading. She wanted me broken. She wanted me gone. But she didn't know. She was only making me stronger. One afternoon, I came home to find a bright orange notice taped to my door. Final warning. It said if I didn't remove my fence plans, if I didn't pay the fines, legal action would begin. It was written like a threat. But to me, it was a challenge. They thought they could scare me into submission. They thought they could crush me with paper and ink, but I had something they didn't know about, something far more powerful than any fine. I had the road. That night I drove down it again, slow, quiet, headlights cutting through the dark. I stopped in the middle, rolled down my window, and listened. The silence was heavy. Not a single car passing, not a single voice in the night. I closed my eyes and imagined it locked, gates at both ends. The whole neighborhood sealed off like a jar, and for the first time in weeks, I felt peace. But the HOA wasn't done. They started sending inspectors to my property, men in polos and clipboards, walking around my yard like they owned it, measuring grass, photographing the shed, circling anything they could write up as a violation. I asked one of them what they were doing. He said, "We're just making sure everything is in compliance." I laughed. Because compliance was just another word for control, the letters grew nastier, the fines heavier. They even sent threats about foreclosure. like they could take my house if I didn't bow down. But here's the thing about power. It doesn't scare the man who has more of it, and I had more than they ever would, because while they sent papers, I held the pavement while they wrote threats. I held the gate in my mind. The breaking point came at the next board meeting. I walked into the clubhouse, the room filled with neighbors, the board seated like kings and queens. The president looked at me like I was dirt on her shoe. She raised her voice, called me a rule breaker, a threat to property values, a stain on the community. She waved the letters in the air, like a hunter showing off the trophies of her kill. The neighbors clapped, some because they believed her, some because they were afraid not to. But I didn't flinch. I stood there, quiet, staring right at her, and I smiled, because while she thought she was shaming me, I knew something she didn't, in that very moment. I already owned the road she drove on to get here, and soon she'd have to come begging to me just to leave. I left the meeting without saying a word, but that silence was louder than any speech. The president followed me with her eyes as I walked out, her smile flickering for the first time, and I knew then. She could feel it too. Her power was slipping, and mine was only beginning. The next morning I sat at my kitchen table with coffee, watching cars roll down the street, families heading to work, kids heading to school, delivery trucks carrying boxes. Every wheel turned on asphalt that belonged to me now. Every life in that neighborhood, whether they knew it or not, was already tied to me. And all it would take was one decision, one locked gate, one moment of truth, to remind them who was really in charge. But I waited, because revenge isn't sweet when it's rushed. Revenge is sweetest when it's slow, when it drips like honey, when every second builds suspense. And I wanted them to taste it, so I kept playing along, letting the fines stack higher, letting the president smile her empty smile, letting the board pretend they were still in charge, because every day they pushed me harder was another day they were unknowingly tightening the noose around their own necks, and that noose was the road beneath their tires. But let me ask you this. If you had the power to trap an entire neighborhood, to make them feel the same fear they forced on you, would you do it right away, or would you let them sweat first, the night after the board meeting? I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the sound of cars rolling down the road outside my window, each one passing over asphalt that I owned now, each one reminding me that the neighborhood wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. The next morning, I woke to find another envelope taped to my door. But this one wasn't just a fine, it was thicker, heavier. Inside was a stack of violations. They claimed my grass was too long, my shed too tall, my driveway too steep. Every page was another excuse to punish me. It didn't matter if it was true. The board was desperate now. They wanted to drown me in paper before I could breathe. I sat at the table staring at the pile. My wife asked me what I was going to do. I just smiled, because while they were busy printing papers, I was busy building something real. That evening I went out to the road. I parked my truck sideways across the entrance, just for a few minutes. Cars lined up, horns blaring, neighbors leaning out their windows. Some shouted, some begged, some cursed my name. I just sat there, sipping my drink, pretending to check my phone. And when I finally moved the truck, the looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know. They were scared. Scared not of the fines, not of the board, but of me. Word spread fast by the next day. Everyone in the neighborhood knew I owned the road. Some came to me quietly, asking if it was true. Some begged me not to block it, swore they had nothing to do with the HOA. Others threatened me, told me they'd call the county, the police, even the governor. But the truth was simple. It was mine, and no one could take it back. The HOA president stormed up to my house 2 days later. She didn't smile this time. Her face was tight, her voice sharp. She waved the violation letters in my face and said, "You're ruining this community." I leaned against my truck, calm, quiet, and said, "No, I'm saving it." Her eyes narrowed, her hands shook, because for the first time, she realized she wasn't in control. After that day, everything changed. The board started holding emergency meetings. They tried to rally the neighborhood against me. They called me selfish, reckless, a danger to property values. But people were divided now. Some hated me, but others secretly admired me. I had done what no one else dared to do. I stood up to the president, and I didn't flinch. The whispers grew louder. At the grocery store, at the mailbox, at the gas station nearby, half the town called me a hero, the other half called me a madman. But everyone knew my name now, and everyone knew the road was mine. Then came the night I made my move. It was late, past midnight. The streetlights buzzing faintly over the pavement. I drove out to the entrance with a set of heavy chains and 2 steel gates I had been storing. My hands worked fast, drilling, bolting, locking everything into place. By the time the sun began to rise, the neighborhood had only one new addition, a gate across their freedom. The first car to arrive was a neighbor heading to work. He stopped short, stepped out, stared at the gate in disbelief. He rattled the chains, pounded the lock, then turned to me as I stood there watching. "What are you doing?" he shouted. I didn't answer. I just looked him in the eye, then walked back to my porch, one by one. More cars arrived, mothers late for school runs, men in suits rushing to the office, delivery trucks carrying packages, the line stretched down the block, horns echoing like an angry orchestra. And through it all, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching, smiling. Then came the president. Her black SUV roared up to the gate, brakes screeching. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. She marched up to me with fury in her eyes. "You can't do this," she hissed. I raised an eyebrow, took a slow sip of coffee, and said, "Because I said so." Her face turned red. She screamed about lawsuits, about calling the police, about destroying me. But deep down, she knew the truth. The road was mine, the power was mine, and there was nothing she could do. That day was chaos, cars trapped, neighbors furious, kids missing school. Some shouted at me, some pleaded, some just sat quietly in their cars staring. And as I watched the scene unfold, I realized something. For years the HOA had ruled this neighborhood with fear. Now, for the first time, they were the ones afraid. I didn't keep the gate locked forever. After a few hours, I opened it again. I let the cars roll through, let the neighborhood breathe. But the message was clear. They weren't free anymore. They lived on my terms now. That night, the board sent another letter, but this time, it wasn't a fine. It was a demand. They ordered me to remove the gate immediately, or face serious consequences. I pinned the letter to my fridge and laughed, because it wasn't power talking anymore. It was desperation. The next morning, as I drove past the clubhouse, I saw them watching me from the windows, the president's face pale, her eyes dark. She wasn't smiling anymore. She knew the war had changed, and now it was my battlefield. But let me ask you this. If you were sitting in my chair that morning, watching the whole neighborhood trapped behind your gate, would you have opened it? Or would you have let them feel what real control tastes like? The morning after I locked the gate, everything felt different. The air was heavy, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Cars drove slower. Neighbors walked quieter. Even the dogs barked less. It was like they all realized. The road beneath their feet wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. The president tried to pretend nothing had changed. She sent out more letters, more threats, more warnings. But her voice was trembling now. Her power was cracking. Because every time she drove through that gate, she had to stop, roll down her window, and look me in the eyes. And every time, I smiled back at her, a smile that said, "You don't own me anymore." The board scrambled for options. They tried calling the county, but the county told them the truth. The road had been sold years ago, and it was legally mine. They tried calling the police, but the police told them it was a civil matter, no crime, no trespassing, no help. And so the board was stuck, trapped in their own cage, a cage I had built with nothing more than a signature and a gate. The neighbors started to change too. At first, they glared at me, they cursed under their breath when they drove past. But slowly, something shifted. A few came to my porch quietly. They knocked on my door, asked me how I did it. They whispered their own stories. The letters, the fines, the humiliation. One man told me the board had fined him for leaving his trash cans out too long. A woman told me they wrote her up for planting the wrong color flowers. An elderly couple said they threatened foreclosure over a cracked driveway. Every story was the same. Every story ended with shame and fear. And now, for the first time, they weren't afraid anymore, because someone had stood up. The president hated it. She could feel her grip slipping away, so she pushed harder. She doubled the fines, tripled the threats, sent inspectors to my house every other day. But all her fury only made her weaker, because the more she fought me, the more the neighbors saw the truth. She wasn't protecting the community. She was protecting her throne. One evening, I walked the road just as the sun was setting. The asphalt glowed orange, the sky burned red, and I realized I didn't just own a strip of pavement, I owned their peace of mind. Every car that touched those wheels, every foot that stepped on that ground, it was a reminder that their freedom had a price, and I was the one who set it. The board called an emergency meeting the next week. The president stood at the front, her voice sharp, her hands shaking. She ranted about me, called me a tyrant, a bully, a danger to the neighborhood. She told them I had to be stopped, that I was destroying property values, destroying lives. But when she asked for a show of hands, something happened she didn't expect. Only half the room raised their arms. The other half stayed quiet. Some even looked at me, with something I never thought I'd see in their eyes. Respect. The president froze. She looked at the room, then at me, and for the first time, she didn't smile. For the first time, she looked afraid. I walked out of that meeting without saying a word, but as I pushed the door open, I could hear the whispers. Some said I was dangerous, but others said I was the only one brave enough to fight back. And that was when I knew the balance of power had shifted. The HOA wasn't untouchable anymore. Their fear had turned against them. That night, I sat on my porch again, watching the streetlights flicker across my gate. I thought about everything that had happened. The letters, the fines, the humiliation. And I thought about how it all began with one simple fence. One dream they tried to crush. But instead, they woke something inside me, something they couldn't control, couldn't fine, couldn't stop. The president thought she had broken me, but the truth was, she had built me. She turned me from a homeowner into a fighter, from a target into a threat. And now, I wasn't just defending my dream, I was defending everyone who ever felt powerless under her rules. The phone rang that night. It was a neighbor, a woman I barely knew. She whispered into the phone, "Don't stop." And then she hung up. I sat there in the dark, the weight of her words sinking in. Don't stop. Because this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. And I was the one holding the key. The next morning, as the sun rose, I locked the gate again, not for long, just for a few hours, enough to remind them, enough to let them feel it, enough to make the president sweat as she sat trapped in her SUV at the front of the line. I stood there watching her in the rearview mirror of my truck, her fingers tapping the wheel, her jaw tight, her eyes full of rage and fear, and I smiled again, because the war was no longer mine alone. The neighborhood had chosen a side, and whether they admitted it or not, they were standing behind me. But let me ask you this. If you had the power to turn fear into respect, to make an entire board tremble every time they looked at you, would you use it to crush them completely, or would you let them destroy themselves little by little? The day of the real showdown started like any other. The sun was bright. The birds were loud. The neighborhood looked calm. But beneath that calm, I could feel the storm coming. Another envelope was waiting in my mailbox. This one stamped with bold red letters, "Final Notice." Inside was a threat so heavy it almost made me laugh. The board was demanding that I remove the gate immediately, or they would sue me for damages. They promised to drain my bank account, take my home, leave me with nothing. But what they didn't know was that I had already prepared for this day. I pinned the letter on my fridge next to all the others, and then I poured myself a coffee, because I knew by the end of the week, it wouldn't be me begging, it would be them. That night I locked the gate tighter than before, thicker chains, heavier locks, steel that glistened under the moonlight. And then I waited. The next morning, the chaos began. Cars backed up down the street, neighbors honking, kids crying, delivery trucks trapped in line. I sat on my porch with my coffee again, watching it unfold like a movie I had seen 100 times in my head. The president arrived last. Her black SUV screeched to a stop at the gate. She slammed her door shut and stormed toward me. Her heels clacked against the pavement like gunshots. Her face was red, her eyes full of fire. "You've gone too far," she hissed. "You're destroying this community." I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady, and said, "No, I'm setting it free." Her voice rose higher. Shrill with panic, she shouted about lawsuits, about lawyers, about the end of me. But behind her, I saw the faces of the neighbors, not angry at me anymore. Angry at her. They were stuck, trapped, late for work, late for school, and all of them knew the truth. It wasn't me who caused this war. It was her. One man stepped out of his car, then another. They gathered around, quiet at first. But then voices started rising. "Enough," one shouted. "He's not the problem," another said. And soon the whispers turned into a roar. The crowd was against her now. The same people she once controlled with fear were turning on her in plain daylight. The president froze. She looked around, saw the anger in their eyes. Her hands shook as she realized she had lost them. She had lost everything. She turned back to me, but I didn't need to say a word. I just stood up slowly, walked to the gate, and placed my hand on the chain. The crowd fell silent, waiting, watching. I looked at her one last time, then I clicked the lock open. The gate swung wide. Cars rolled through. People cheered softly under their breath. But no one was cheering for her. That moment broke her. She wasn't the queen anymore. She wasn't the voice of power. She was just another neighbor, stuck on a road she didn't own, in a community she no longer controlled. Word spread like wildfire after that day. The board's threats grew quieter. The fines slowed down. The inspector stopped showing up at my house. It was like the war had ended without me even lifting a weapon. All I did was hold a gate closed, and the HOA destroyed itself from the inside. But revenge is a strange thing. It doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes in silence. Sometimes it comes in the way people look at you differently, in the way they look at her differently, in the way she avoids my eyes every time she drives past my house. Now I kept the gate up, not locked all the time. Out there as a reminder, a symbol of the fight. A warning to anyone who thought they could control me again, and every time I walked past it, I felt that rush of victory, not because I had trapped them, but because I had freed myself. Weeks later, the president resigned quietly. She sent out an email claiming personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. She didn't step down. She was pushed out by her own people, by her own rules, by her own failure to control the one man she thought she could break. And me, I kept my fence, the red wood shining in the sun, standing tall as the symbol of a battle won. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was proof. Proof that the HOA could be beaten. Proof that the underdog could win. Proof that sometimes the smallest rebellion could topple the biggest throne. But let me ask you this. If you were standing in my shoes, watching the president fall, watching the board crumble, would you let them fade away quietly? Or would you strike one last blow to make sure they never rise again? The neighborhood feels different now, quieter, softer, like the air itself finally took a deep breath. The board doesn't send letters anymore. No inspectors walk my yard with clipboards. No fines appear in my mailbox. The threats, the fear, the endless paper chains, all gone. The president disappeared too. Her black SUV still drives past sometimes, but she never looks my way. She doesn't wave. She doesn't smile. She doesn't even pretend anymore. She just keeps her eyes on the road, the same road that doesn't belong to her, the same road that will never belong to her again. The new board tried to pick up the pieces. They sent out a soft little letter, thanking the old president for her service. They promised to be fairer, kinder, more understanding. But their words had no teeth anymore, because the moment they look at me, they remember the gate, they remember the day the neighborhood rose against their queen, they remember that the road beneath their tires still belongs to me. It's funny. In the beginning, I only wanted a fence, just a simple red fence around my land. Something harmless, something mine. But the HOA turned that fence into a war, and now that war has turned me into something I never expected, not just a homeowner, not just a fighter, but the man who taught them what power really looks like. The neighbors treat me differently now. Some wave when they pass, some nod quietly, a few even stop by to chat, to share their own little victories against the board. It's like the whole community woke up, like they realized they didn't have to live in fear anymore, and all it took was one man saying no. Still, I know not everyone loves me. There are whispers in the dark. Some say I went too far, that I humiliated the president, that I embarrassed the board, but every time I hear those whispers, I smile, because I didn't do anything to them they didn't already do to me. They built this game. I just learned to play it better. The road is quiet at night now. Sometimes I walk it alone. The moonlight glowing on the asphalt, I listen to the silence, feel the weight of everything that happened. And I wonder if they ever think about it too, if they ever lie awake in their perfect beige houses, remembering the day they were trapped at my gate, remembering the way their fear tasted when they realized they weren't in control anymore. Sometimes I almost feel sorry for the president, because I know what it's like to hold power too tightly, to believe you're untouchable, only to watch it all crumble in a single day. But then I think about all the letters, all the threats, all the families she hurt just to protect her throne, and the pity fades away because she wasn't a victim, she was a tyrant, and tyrants don't deserve pity. My fence still stands. He same red wood the president once called too gaudy. Now it glows in the sunlight, bold, unashamed. It's more than just wood now. It's a reminder that dreams are worth fighting for, that even in the quietest suburb, power can shift in the blink of an eye, that even the smallest rebellion can change everything. The road still belongs to me too, and sometimes, when I feel the urge, I closed the gate again, not for long. Not to punish anyone, just as a reminder to them, and to me, of how quickly control can change hands. And when I hear the first car horn blare, I sip my coffee and smile, because the truth is, I won long ago. The rest is just echoes. And yet, even after all this, I still ask myself the same question every time I walk past that gate. Did I win because I fought? Or did I win because they were already weak? Did I break the board? Or did the board break itself? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is that I finally learned the truth about power. It doesn't come from titles, or meetings, or handbooks full of rules. It comes from knowing when to stand up and when to shut the gate. But now, let me ask you this. If you had been me from the start, would you have built the fence anyway? Defied the HOA no matter what? Or would you have played it safe and let them win before the fight ever began?